effective CV. Today we're going to talk about we're going to talk about what a CV is versus a resume. We're going to talk about formatting. We're going to talk about some considerations when it comes to content. We're going to talk about getting started writing a CV, and we're going to talk about CV structure. As Mary mentioned, the presentation is being recorded. So one of the questions I get asked often is the difference between a CV and a resume. One of the main differences is length. Resumes have a tendency to be shorter, more condensed. CVs have a tendency to be longer. One of the main differences is resumes have a tendency to be briefer. There's a tendency to give highlights, whereas a CV has a tendency to be longer. More detail is often included. And that's because CVs need to be longer. More detail is often needed, especially when it comes to research-oriented activities. Really, the details are very important when it comes to a CV. CVs are more academically oriented. More often when you're looking for a more academically oriented position, such as a research or teaching position. So oftentimes those details are more important, very focused upon. So it is really important that you include those details. So you do need that length and that time and that space. So in a CV, you do really want to make sure that you do include those details, and you are going to need that length in a CV. In terms of formatting a CV, you definitely want to make sure that your margins are no larger than an inch. Definitely want to make sure that you mind that lower margin. Sometimes you do want to be very careful about making sure that the content on the bottom does not get cut off. You also want to be very careful about how you space your section breaks. Oftentimes, you do want to be aware of how kind of you place those section breaks, because you don't necessarily want to make sure that those sections break unevenly, that you don't want to have kind of one or two bullet points that kind of hang off onto the next page. You definitely want to kind of mind how you format any sort of content that might hang over onto that second page. In terms of font, definitely making sure that it's easy to read. Oftentimes, especially when people are trying to manage how the content looks, one of the first things that people will do is they'll start shrinking the font size. I definitely recommend that the font not be smaller than 11. 12-point font is good. I would not make it any smaller than 11-point font, however. In terms of which font you choose, some commonly accepted fonts include Times New Roman, Calibri, Arial. Those are all good fonts. I would strongly recommend against using any fonts that are very complex, Gothic fonts. Any fonts where the letters touch become very difficult, especially when you get into uploading your documents into any electronic systems. Then that becomes particularly problematic. So I strongly encourage you to use some clear fonts. Like I said, Times New Roman, Calibri, Arial, those are all good fonts to use. Now, I would also offer an additional tip. Make sure that before you send your documents via email, before you post them on any electronic systems, it's a good idea to save your documents as PDFs, because that way your beautifully written CV doesn't get distorted. Oftentimes, we've all had that experience where we write our perfectly written documents as Word documents, we send them, someone opens them, and then the document that they open looks very different than the one that we send. So I strongly recommend that you save as a PDF before you post it or you send it. And really, when you format, make sure consistency is key. If you choose to use punctuation at the end of your phrases, I think it's a very good idea to make sure that you do that consistently throughout.
Hey, Deb, sorry to interrupt, but I think for some reason we can't see your slides advancing.
That's interesting. Let me stop sharing and then try it again.
Thank you. It was stuck on the cover sort of with the just overall PowerPoint instead of the slideshow, I think.
Is it advancing there, Mary?
I see content considerations. That's the slide.
That's interesting. Okay, it doesn't look like it's working.
So maybe you shared the wrong screen if you have more than one window open.
No, I just have the one open.
Okay.
Technical difficulties.
Yes. Apologies.
Yes.
See, it was showing just like if you have the PowerPoint generally open and you could see all of the little slides on the left, but it
Right.
wasn't showing like the full presentation view.
Right. Okay. Do you see the title slide?
No. When you clicked from beginning, I think it shared probably onto a different screen. It might have been a pop-up on your computer.
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe you can just advance through without doing it as the slideshow and kind of just right in that window.
Is that any better?
Now I can't see anything. Sorry.
Okay. Okay.
We'll get there.
Okay. Okay. Do you see
Yeah.
any slides yet?
So I see all of the slides. I see it as your window of PowerPoint, and it's CV versus resume
Okay.
at the top. So if you, I mean, maybe if you just go with that and
That's good.
click
Okay.
through. Yeah.
That's fine.
Thank
Okay.
you.
No problem. Alrighty. So, as you prepare to write your document, one of the biggest tips that I have that I think is most effective, because this will really help you as you think about preparing your information. I think it's a great idea to sit down and to think about really trying to put together what I like to call a massive, mega, super resume or CV, where you really want to put a comprehensive document together that lists everything: your education, your employment, any clinical experience, volunteer experience, leadership experience, whatever you can remember. I think that's probably the best idea. Now, it is quite a big task, but I think that it's really important, because really what this does for you is this puts together a complete menu of anything that you can have. It identifies specific tasks, projects, functions, outcomes, people, etc. Now, like I said, it's a big job, but there's two really important benefits. It actually kind of provides the starting point for you to tailor your CV and your resume, because you might actually want to create both depending on what you're applying for, and you might apply for two different types of opportunities. It has to tailor your documents to the positions that you apply for, and because hopefully the goal of all of this is to impress an employer enough so that they invite you for an interview. It also helps you then prepare for an interview as well, because you will probably not list everything that's on your mega massive super CV or resume on the actual document that you send. You'll still probably want to reference something maybe in the actual interview. And that will actually also appear in this massive document. So it'll be a nice memory jog for you as well. Now, in terms of the structure, we'll kind of maybe walk through this step by step. Now, to start the document, obviously you want to start with you, your contact information. I would definitely suggest, and this sounds a little kind of silly, but definitely starting with your name. Your complete first name, your last name. I'm also going to maybe encourage you to put your middle name or your middle initial, especially if you have a common first name, last name. Again, just differentiating yourself. Your address information. Now, again, I often get asked, do you need to put address information? Well, maybe you don't, but I think that if you do, it's okay to put either a singular address, bit of address information, if you are applying in an area that you have maybe some sort of attachment to, that maybe you currently don't live in, but maybe you have some sort of affiliation with it, that you're not currently there, but you have maybe another affiliation with it. Let's say, you don't live there currently, but you do have maybe a permanent affiliation with it. You can put a current and a permanent address. And again, you just want to make the decision based on like the opportunity and the practicality. Definitely putting a phone number so that they can reach you. And if you do that, make sure that that phone number has a set of voicemail, and that you don't have that voicemail full. Make sure that voicemail greeting is professional as well. And definitely make sure you have an appropriate email address listed as well. You can also have your LinkedIn address on that contact information as well, if you should so choose. Now, if you do choose to indicate your LinkedIn information, make sure that it is complete and set up. I also recommend next that you put your educational information. Now, you want to list your degrees here. Now, we do say list all your degrees, probably not your high school diploma. Definitely have that information kind of written down somewhere for yourself, because if you do have to fill out an actual application, you do want to reference that information. And for some of us, especially in the academic world, it might have been some time since we've last graduated from high school. So just to have that information handy for reference, but you don't necessarily need to put that on your actual CV. You want to make sure that you have the official degree name or names, the institution, the city, the state, the ending date, the graduation date. You can actually remove the language of expected graduation. You can just list the date. You want to make sure that you have the official dissertation and or thesis title. You want to list your committee, and you designate your chair and your advisor names as well. Now, the language that you're going to use on your CV. Now, your job here is to paint a picture of your skills and your experience. Now, make sure that you use field-specific language, okay? This is the language of your discipline. Now, remember, whoever is reading this understands this. So in some ways, you're demonstrating that you speak the common language. So don't be afraid to use that language of your field. Remember that who's ever reading it is going to understand it. And it's really important that you demonstrate that you have that common language. Make sure that you use common action verbs, use keywords of your discipline. And it's really important to use numerics. Give context. Numerics are important because they demonstrate the capacity and the magnitude of what you're talking about. And definitely consider specifics here. Consider specifics of people, equipment, and situations. And think about the skills that employers want and that you demonstrate those things when you use numerics, those keywords, and those action verbs. Now remember that employers are demanding. They want a lot from their potential employees. And remember, what they want are your skills. And it's your job here in your CV to demonstrate the skills that you have both concretely and accurately. Because from their perspective, what you've done gives you the tools, and those tools go with you to them. That's why they want to hire you. So think about those skills. Well, what are those skills they look for? Well, that's a good question. Now, there's an organization out there called the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And what's important about that is they actually do a survey every year, and they ask employers what sort of skills they look for in employees. Now, NACE is a broad organization. It's not field dependent, and they actually report what skills are most desired in candidates. And those skills that employers seek are thus. These are a listing of skills that employers across the board ask for. And you can see that these skills look pretty familiar to most of us, okay? And it doesn't matter what sort of institution, what sort of field. These are pretty general. But it's really important to see the percentage of employers that look for these skills. So when you think about demonstrating skills, focus on these: teamwork, problem solving, detail-oriented abilities, interpersonal, technical, computer skills. It's really important to think about how you demonstrate the skills that employers look for. So when you think about, hey, should I talk about this or that? Think about, does that item or do those items fall within these categories? As you think about how you actually describe what you've done, think about the fact that how you describe those things actually serve as an example of your written communication skills. And you can see that 75% of employers really value written communication skills. So in a way, you're already demonstrating that you do have written communication skills just by doing the exercise of writing your CV. When you think about how you describe what it is that you've done, think about the individuals that you are interacting with. Think about the population types. Think about the setting. Think about, are the populations you've interacted with, are they urban, rural, suburban? Think about the projects or initiatives that you have done. Think about the titles of individuals. Now, when you list that you have interacted with someone, you're probably not going to list their name, but it's a good idea to maybe list their title, because it's really important to say that you collaborated with the project manager, or you collaborated with the associate dean, for example, because that tells someone kind of the interaction with the levels of level of organization that you've interacted with. It explains that you're not afraid and that you're very comfortable working with someone who has a different kind of place in an organization than you do. Make sure when you describe what you've done that you focus on action and result. Because again, it's fine to say that you've done something, but it's really important to follow that up with what the result was. Walk the person through the process of what you've done. Walk them through your daily activities. Don't just say miscellaneous activities. Actually kind of walk them through that process of what happens. Now, to you, those activities probably were commonplace, but you have to remember that the employer doesn't know what your daily activities were like. And of course, think about the semester and the academic year. For you, those things were commonplace. There was a process that happened typically. But again, every organization, every institution is different. So kind of walk them through the process of what happened every semester, every academic year. And perhaps one of the biggest challenges, of course, is to update as you go. I know that oftentimes things are busy, but it's really important to take some time every so often and maybe make an opportunity every couple weeks or so and just take time out to update your documents as you go. Because if you don't, time will kind of get away from you. And it will be a bigger challenge to try to remember where you left off and to find time then to go back even further and to update as you go. As you talk about research experience, this one's really important. Make sure that you highlight important skills, things that you've done, certain processes, certain manipulations. Think about those projects. Now, in an academic environment, we really live and breathe our research projects. Think about the accomplishments. Think about kind of where you started. Think about the adjustments that you had to make. Think about the challenges that you encountered in your research and how you had to adjust, how you had to refocus, how you had to really kind of tweak what you were doing to kind of deal with perhaps challenges in your research. Now, when you talk about your research experience, make sure you include your dissertation, your thesis title, and your dissertation or thesis advisor in the education section. And again, think about, because you will have research and teaching sections, think about maybe how you want to order those sections based on the position that you are going to be applying for. If you're going to be applying for a research-focused position, you may want to kind of have that research section a little bit higher in the order on the document. If you're going to be looking at a teaching-focused position, that teaching section may want to take precedence. And think about the process of research. Think about what existed kind of when you stepped into the process, because maybe nothing existed. Maybe you had to start from the ground up. Maybe there was no literature review. Maybe you had to kind of think of the topic. Think about what you created, what you gathered. Maybe think about what you modified in the process. Think about kind of what you encountered. Think about how you kind of maybe tweaked the idea. Think about kind of what you did in the whole process. And if you did something, if you kind of had ideas along the way, own that. and really take credit for that. Let's talk about teaching next. Think about the hows of teaching, of review, of office hours, of practice. The teaching experience is a very large process. Think about the course levels, because there are many course levels when you teach. Think about the introductory, think about the intermediate, think about the advanced teaching courses. Think about the courses. Were they requirements? Were they prerequisites? Were they requisites? Were they electives? And who took these courses? Were they for majors? Were they for non-majors? Or were they for specific populations? And think about the numbers here. We talked about numerics earlier. How many sections and how many students per sections? Now, maybe your title was teaching assistants, but sometimes there are teaching assistants that actually are the sole instructors. Now, did you perhaps run review sessions? Did you put together practice sets? Did you meet individually with students? What did you actually do in that teaching? So really, I think it's important that you sit down and you think about kind of what you are actually doing. And I think that's helpful as you think about kind of that teaching. And think about kind of what sort of kind of methods of teaching you were doing. Were you relating the concepts to something else the students knew to help them really understand the concepts in an individual way? Let's talk about technical skills. And these can be many things. Think about computer skills, kind of any sort of hardware, any sort of software, and also think about programming skills. And think about your instrumentation and your laboratory skills. Think about that data collection and analysis. And make sure when you talk about your technical skills that you indicate proficiency levels. Now, it's okay in a variety of the skills that you have to have a variety of proficiency levels. So when you think about your data analysis skills, you may have a variety of proficiency levels with a variety of different data programs. You might be experienced with SPSS, for example. You might have basic knowledge of Microsoft Access, and that's okay. You are demonstrating to an employer that you are trying to give them as accurate a picture as possible. And trust me, they appreciate that, okay? Now, they may actually want you to do some testing so that they can assess that for themselves, but they really do appreciate that you are trying to be as accurate as possible. Because again, they want to avoid any sort of disconnect in terms of your proficiency level. And they do appreciate that you are trying to give them that picture as accurately as possible. Let's talk about publications next. You want to make sure that you utilize the accepted reference format in your field. You know it well. You can actually group your publications according to a type, the type of publication that it is, if you have a sufficient number. So books, book chapters, journal publications, accepted journal papers in review, conference papers, so on and so forth, okay? It all depends on what you have. Sometimes publications, just as a general title, is enough if that kind of encompasses what you have. If you have a few of them, they can be put together. If you have a large number of them, you can separate them by these categories. But again, it all depends on kind of what you have. And that will change over time. As you accumulate more, you may want to separate them out. If you have presentations, that might be an actual separate one. And that actually kind of leads me to my next slide. Presentations, invited lectures. And again, when you list those, you're going to list the type. Is it a keynote address? Is it a poster presentation? You're going to list the title. You're going to list the name of the conference or workshop, the location, the date. And I often get asked about what about conferences and things that you attend. You can actually have an additional training section for those conferences that you attend. It's really good to show that you are invested in your field, you're invested in your own development and in your profession. It's a good talking point as well. So definitely maybe consider an additional training section or additional, conference attendance section if you should like. I definitely recommend, if you have them, an honors and awards section. And like the rest of the documents, listing them in reverse chronological order. Make sure that though that they're relevant. Think about any fellowships, any honors, any grants, certainly any academic distinctions. I think it's important to note as well that it could be a good idea for you to include a short description if needed. Because a lot of times there are different honors, awards, etc., that by the title don't necessarily explain what they're for. So, for example, many people don't really know what the Ray E. Kesey Award is. And if you list that you've received it, that's great, but there's very few folks who actually know what on earth it is for. And what I encourage people to do in that case is that if you just list that you are the recipient, comma, the Ray E. Kesey Award, the institution or entity that that awards it, the city, the state, and the date that it was awarded, and then below use a bullet point or so, and then actually maybe utilize maybe if you received a letter or a certificate and has some sort of language on it that explains something about, you've received this award in recognition of whatever. Use some of the language from that document or certificate and maybe, kind of incorporate it in that bullet point and explain kind of what it's for so that the reader will actually understand kind of what the honor is kind of pertaining to. I think it's helpful, again, and it's just a nice opportunity for you to kind of explain what it is that you are being kind of honored for. Let's talk about professional affiliations. As you know, in an academic setting, it's really important to be involved in your discipline. And I think it's really helpful that you distinguish yourself in terms of the different affiliations that you have. You definitely want to be very clear and separate out the roles that you have in the professional organizations. And you might have various roles in perhaps the same organization. For many of us, we may start in an organization as a general member, which is fine. And then we may actually then progress to, say, a leadership role, which is excellent as well. And what I would say is that, it's good to list your membership in an organization. You want to list that title of member. You want to list the name of the organization. You want to list the location of the organization. Now, if the organization is a national organization, you want to list that headquartered location. If you are a part of an organization, a chaptered organization, you want to list that chapter information. You want to list the dates of the involvement for that role. Now, if you are a leader in an organization, what I would suggest is that you actually have a separate section, maybe call it leadership or service, and list the leadership roles separately. Because if you remember from that skill section that we talked about, leadership is one of those skills that employers find very valuable. So you would be very wise to kind of highlight that separately. And I'm going to maybe encourage you to maybe have that leadership or service section, maybe put that up a little earlier in the CV than the professional affiliation. Because again, if perchance the employer doesn't necessarily maybe make it through the entire document, and I'm certainly hoping they will read the whole thing, but if they don't get through the entire thing, I would want them to maybe see your leadership first. And maybe if they don't get to all of the professional affiliations, I guess I would want them to see that leadership before they see the rest of the professional affiliations. I think that it's important, though, that as a member, if you are doing something, if you are active, I think it's really important for you to make sure that you claim that involvement and talk about what you're doing. So using some bullet points and using some action verbs to explain what you're doing as a member. I think one of the first things that an employer has as a question is, what is your involvement? What are you doing outside of paying your dues and attending meetings? What is your contribution to the organization? How are you being involved? So really, even if you don't necessarily have an official title of a leadership role, what is your involvement? What are you contributing? So to make you think about that, if you're suggesting ideas for topics, if you are assisting in organizing a event or a meeting, if you are mentoring younger members, definitely think about that and maybe put some language in there around that. So really kind of giving it some thought and using some action verbs to really kind of think about how you are contributing to the organization, what your involvement actually looks like in that organization. Again, thinking about that professional service and that leadership experience. As you highlight those leadership roles, think about how, what, and who did you lead? Think about the focus on the results. So a lot of times in organizations, there are conferences, symposiums, those sorts of things that folks will organize. So if for some reason you are doing something like that, think about listing that information. And when you do, give the numerics. How many people attended? How many number of sessions? How many presenters? Think about if there's fundraising involved, how much money was raised? What percentage increase was that over the year before? If you are peer reviewing articles, mention that. Think about, mention the name of the journal. If you were moderating sessions, mention the session. If you were participating in committees, mention the committee name and maybe highlight the achievement of the committees and say how many people were on the committee and how many times it met, for a certain time period. So give some specifics because these are really tangible things that a potential employer can latch onto and really understand. Let's talk about community involvement as well. Again, you want to make sure that you give a title. Obviously, volunteer will suffice if you need to, but if you can be specific about kind of maybe what else you were doing, if you were a volunteer coordinator, if you were a volunteer mentor, definitely make sure that you kind of flesh that out if you can. You want to make sure that you list the organization, the location, the date, and try again to give a description of kind of what you're actually doing. And again, remember all those qualities that we talked about before. Talk about kind of the individuals involved. Talk about the actions that are happening. Because again, these are really important things that you want to kind of mention because they do transfer. They do demonstrate the skills that employers look for. Let's talk about languages, okay? If you do have any acumen in languages, it's really important that you mention it, okay? You want to mention any sort of foreign languages that you might have experience with. You want to list the name of the language that you may have experience with, and don't forget the dialect as well. You do want to list the proficiency level. And you do want to make sure that you use the ACTFL scale. And I've listed the ACTFL website at the bottom here. It's actfl.org. You can look up your proficiency level. There's guidelines there. And you want to make sure that you differentiate listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Because it is very common for someone, especially if it is a second language, especially to have different proficiency levels in these 4 different kind of areas, especially if it's a second language. And I know this kind of it should go without saying, but I think we do probably need to say you do want to spell check and double check. You do want to look for unintentional changes because, as we know, sometimes spell check is wrong. This is a big document, and here's an editing tip. I would say make all your changes, save it, close your document, do something else, and come back later when you can review it with a fresh perspective. Oftentimes when we look at these things, it really kind of just has a tendency to just really just become a little monotonous. When you have a fresh perspective, it really kind of helps us see things that we may have missed. We will work on these documents so often and create so many versions of our CVs that I recommend that when you will have so many versions of your CV, save each version of your CV with the date as part of the file name so you'll know which version is the most recent. It will really help you kind of orient your document in terms of time, kind of help you know where kind of you were working on it, kind of where in your career progression you were when you were doing it. That's a really good tip to help. Now, in terms of things to avoid, you definitely want to avoid graphics. Resumes and CVs are different around the world. And I know that, if you are, let's say, a marketing major, your documents are going to look very different. But in general, we do want to avoid graphics. It really needs to be a very kind of simple document visually. Again, and we also want to avoid photos. Again, around the world, documents look very different, but an American style CV is free of photos. Personal information, and by personal information, I mean marital status, date of birth. An American CV does not have that sort of information in it. I also want to caution folks of using the words responsible for and the words worked, because these words don't necessarily give you credit for the actions that you do. In general, if you use the words responsible for, usually there's an action verb that follows, so you can just eliminate the words responsible for. And after that, you can just use that action verb, delete the words responsible for, and you should be good there. With the word worked, usually there's a really more specific verb you can use. Usually worked refers to a collaboration. Usually it refers to some sort of, deeper verb. So I encourage you, if you see the word worked, maybe just to look at that a little bit closer to see if there's something more specific you have in mind. Definitely want to avoid any sort of inaccurate information. Sometimes when you work on your CV, you do want to make sure that you fact check yourself. And the nice part is that when you refer to information that's in the past, you really only need to do that once. Again, if it's in the past, the information doesn't change. Once you fact check that, you're good to go. And when you put information on there as you go, again, you don't have to do that again. Reference information. That's something usually that's a separate document. Usually you will put together a document that lists the names, contact information of individuals who are willing to serve as a reference for you. That is really a separate document, so you do not want to include that information directly on the CV. You don't want to put any sort of vague descriptions on your CV. You want to make sure that you are specific, that you give good detail, because you always want to remember that whoever is looking at this is going to know exactly what you mean when you give technical information. Remember that this is their language, and they want to know that the two of you are speaking the same language. That really helps them feel comfortable knowing that the two of you are connecting in that way. So be specific, because they're going to know exactly what you mean. They're going to feel very comfortable with interviewing you, knowing that there's going to be a very high degree of synergy there, knowing that that language is the same. So I'm wondering if we can take some questions, if anyone has any at this point.
Does anyone have any questions? Looks like we have one in the chat. If you volunteer at another organization, such as a church, for example, should that be on your CV?
That's a good question. I think that, if you've had a volunteer position, I think that you can include it. I think that, certainly if you've done it for a long time, I think that's a great something to put on there. I think because, again, it just kind of adds to kind of something about who you are as a person, particularly if it's been for an extended amount of time. It just kind of explains how you've been able to balance that with everything else.
Great. And then another one was, how many pages should a standard resume be?
Okay. And I think the question was about a standard resume. A standard resume, it depends on kind of the discipline. A standard resume can be a page. I think it depends on the discipline. A resume for someone in nursing, pharmacy can be 2 pages. A CV, because I think I see a question there about a page limit for a CV. A page limit for a CV really doesn't exist because a CV is more of an unlimited document. It can be many pages because it covers research, it covers publication. I don't want to say it's unlimited, but you definitely have more pages that you can encompass with your information.
Great. And I think there's another question. Can you clarify reverse chronological order?
Sure. Reverse chronological order is a fancy way of saying most recent first by start date. So what I would do if I'm writing in reverse chronological order is I would start with what I am doing right now, and I basically walk backwards in time. It's kind of the opposite of what we usually do, right? We start at the beginning and we walk our way forward, but actually it's kind of the opposite. We start what we're doing right now and we walk our way backwards.
And then the next component of the question is, as a student, can I add my research project?
Absolutely. You can do that in a couple different ways. A lot of times folks will have a research project section. Sometimes folks will add that into the education section if they like, but I find most often folks will actually have a research section just because research is really important, and I think it really in some ways deserves a section all to itself.
Great. And someone's wondering if this PowerPoint will be available to share.
I believe that the presentation is being recorded, so I'm sure that
Yes.
someone could view it. Yes.
Yes, we'll have this recorded. Next question, is there a specific format for listing dissertation title, committee members / advisor?
Yes. In the education section, someone would write dissertation. They'd put a semicolon and they would write the title. And then on the line below, they would write advisor, and then they would write the person's name, comma, PhD, if that is their academic designation. And then on the line below, they would write committee members and then a semicolon, and then they would write the names and the academic designations of the committee members.
Great. These are great questions. Okay, let's see. Dissertation title and committee members, are these included when the work is still in progress or after it's done?
These can be included when the work is in progress and after it is completed. So as soon as you have your working title and you have that commitment from your committee and your advisor, and sometimes I know that things change. So if you have the circumstance where you have a advisor change, a committee member change, if that happens, as soon as it happens, you would just make that slight change on your document.
Okay, if committee members are from other universities or industries, should this be indicated or should the names just be listed?
That's a great question because that does happen. Sometimes you will have a mix. So you might have a mix of folks from industry as well as academia. So you can actually list their affiliation if you like. I think that you can list their affiliations, just to be proper. I mean, I think that that would be a nice way to do it, to show that you have a multidisciplinary committee. Great questions.
Does anyone have anything else? I'm not seeing any other questions. These were great. All right. Well, if that's it, thank you so much for presenting. This was fantastic. I will send you a list of everyone who attended, and we'll be making this session available on our symposium platform.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day.